In 1963, George Harrison wrote his first complete song, Don't Bother Me, which was the fourth track on the album with the Beatles, and then after this he kept working away in the background at writing songs, practicing and practicing at working on songwriting. By 1966, the quality of George's songs were improving and he managed to get himself 3 songs onto Revolver, including the opening track on the album, Taxman. However, the vast amount of the Beatles' output was still written by either Lennon or McCartney, so George spent a large proportion of 1966 and 1967 learning and playing the sitar. He was composing a lot of songs on the sitar as opposed to the guitar. He kind of fell out of love with the guitar for that period. However, by 1968, George was now penning songs that were of the same standard and the same quality as Lennon and McCartney's songs. However, he was still having to make do with just 2 songs per album. His songs were still an afterthought. Lennon and McCartney was still the prime focus. George was just a castaway, really, just forgotten about. So welcome back to the White Album in depth, and today, as you can maybe see, I am wearing my finest Mad Day Out George Harrison outfit. Yes, welcome back. This is episode 7, While My Guitar Gently Weeps. The Beatles spent spring 1968 in Rishikesh in India studying meditation under the guidance of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. So whilst there, George Harrison managed to re-engage with the guitar. He'd spent the previous 2 years focusing all his attention on the sitar, but here he was stripped away from the sitar with nothing but an acoustic guitar, so he rediscovered his love for the acoustic guitar. This re-engagement with the guitar marked the beginning of a very prolific period for George as a songwriter. So once back from India, George went to Warrington to visit his parents, and whilst he was there he noticed that they had a new book, a book called I Ching. George was very intrigued by this book, so he decided that he would read it. So after reading the book, George took from it the Eastern concept of everything being relative to everything else, which was in comparison to the Western view of everything being merely coincidental. Tried to say that drunk. So taking on board this concept of relativism, George decided that he would write a song based on whatever the first words were in the book, and the book's first words happened to be Gently Weeps, so he decided that he would write a song using the words Gently Wept. So these words, Gently Weeps, would serve as the genesis for the song, and from here George would start applying new lyrics to a melody he'd previously written while in India. Now for the rest of the lyrics, Harrison drew inspiration from the disharmonious atmosphere within the Beatles that had existed since the band had gotten back from India. It had been George Harrison who had been the driving force behind the Beatles' involvement with the Maharishi, their trip to India. It was George who was the most into it. He was the one who had pushed the 4 of them to get involved. George viewed this as a spiritual journey, and this was more important than any musical career that the 4 of them had. However, Lennon and McCartney viewed this very differently. Lennon in particular, when he got back from India, was a very vocal critic of the entire Indian experience. He actually wrote a few songs for the White Album which were very dismissive of the whole experience, and we'll get to them songs. In later episodes we'll go into more depth about why Lennon was very dissatisfied with the whole thing. The lyrics also draw inspiration from the isolation that George Harrison was feeling from within the Beatles. Lennon and McCartney, although they could argue and bicker with each other, they still seen each other as equals. They seen each other as equally good songwriters, but they didn't see George Harrison like that. He was still not on their level as far as they were concerned. He was still an afterthought. He was still just sort of little George working away. We'll do a George song once we've done 15 of our songs, that sort of thing. You know, if George will kindly work on 15 of our songs, we'll then go and work on one of his. It was that kind of environment, and George was feeling very isolated and very dissatisfied with it all. The Beatles regrouped at George's house in Esher in the last week of May in 1968. Here they recorded 27 demos acoustically, the vast amount of which would end up on the White Album, and one of these demos was While My Guitar Gently Weeps. Now, at this point the song sounds quite different to how it does in its finished form on the White Album. George also had an additional verse in the song, but this verse would go on to be cut from the final version. This suggests that George probably hadn't finished writing the lyrics by the time he came to record this demo, as the lyrics would change as the months went by. Now, if you've never heard the Esher demo for While My Guitar Gently Weeps, well, good news, you can. You can hear that along with all the rest of them on the 50th anniversary edition of the White Album. On July 25th, 1968, work would begin at Abbey Road on While My Guitar Gently Weeps. Although by this point the Beatles were 2 months into recording the White Album, this was the first day where they actually focused on any George Harrison song. So this session was largely just spent by the Beatles rehearsing the song, so there's not really any recordings of these rehearsals. But at this point, George was still intending for the song to be an acoustic folk song, similar to quite a few of the other tracks on the White Album, like Dear Prudence and Julia and Blackbird and all those sort of songs. Now, at one point during this session, George decided that he would actually attempt to record the song, so he decided he would do it as a solo acoustic performance. Now, at this point, George actually still had an additional verse for the song that wouldn't make the final version. This was the verse about looking from the wings of the play you were staging. This suggests once again that George still hadn't finished the lyrics by this point. You know, he's got lyrics here that wouldn't make the final thing. So yeah. Now, this early acoustic take also had a harmonium overdubbed onto it. Now, we don't actually know who plays this on this early take, but we think it's probably Paul McCartney. So this version of the song is known as Take 1, and you can hear it on Anthology 3. Or, if you want to hear even more, there's also Take 2, which is another acoustic version, which can be heard on the 50th anniversary edition of the White Album. The Beatles returned to work on the song on August 16th, 1968. The band recorded 14 takes that day, with Harrison playing the acoustic guitar, Lennon playing the organ, McCartney playing the bass, and Ringo playing the drums. At this stage, Harrison was still intending for the song to be an acoustic folk song. So after this day of sessions, Harrison then went on holiday to Greece, so work on While My Guitar Gently Weeps stopped for a little while. Work on the song would then continue on September 3rd, 1968. Now, this was actually quite a significant day for the Beatles for two reasons. Firstly, this was the day that Ringo returned to the band. Now, as I've mentioned in previous episodes, whilst the band were recording back in the USSR, Paul was trying to coach Ringo to play the drums a certain way. Ringo took this as criticism, so he quit the band. So for Back in the USSR and Dear Prudence, the Beatles had to record it as a free piece, but it was on this day that Ringo returned to the band. Now, when Ringo got back, he found that George had decorated his drum kit with a load of flowers. Now, unfortunately, there's no images of what George had done with the flowers, of his handiwork, but in the 90s, Oasis did decide that they would recreate this image for the single cover for their 1996 single Don't Look Back in Anger. Although I imagine probably George didn't use the amount of flowers that Oasis have used on this cover. Secondly, George noticed that in the corridors of Abbey Road Studios, or EMI Studios as it was actually known at this point, there was an 8-track recording machine. Now, EMI policy at the time was that whenever a new piece of technology was brought into the studios, it had to be tested before any of the artists could use it. However, when George spied this 8-track machine, he demanded that it was brought into the studio, that it is used from henceforth. So they did. I mean, it's the Beatles, you're not going to argue with them, they're the biggest band in the world. So from this session onwards, everything that the Beatles now recorded at Abbey Road was finally done on an 8-track machine. Anyway, for sessions itself that day, Harrison actually worked alone on overdubbing While My Guitar Gently Weeps, the work that they'd done on the 16th of August. He spent the day recording a backwards guitar solo, but yeah, it didn't make the final thing, it was completely scrapped, so it was really just a wasted day. However, George was not happy. He did not feel that John and Paul were taking this song serious. He didn't feel like they were giving it the attention that he felt that it deserved. So, George decided it was time to get radical. On September 5th, 1968, George was giving Eric Clapton a lift from Surrey to London, where he decided to ask Eric Clapton to come and play lead guitar on While My Guitar Gently Weeps, that day's sessions. Now, Eric Clapton, by this point, believed that George Harrison was a mighty fine songwriter. He was as good a songwriter as anyone else out there, but he believed that Lennon and McCartney were holding George back. Now, Eric Clapton was originally very reluctant to take part in this because he felt that the Beatles, you know, they'd never done this before. Whenever they'd used outside musicians, it was only for things like strings or like random instruments. It was never for things like guitar or bass or drums or anything like that. They were the primary instruments. They were what the Beatles themselves did. Nobody messed with that. So Eric thought, well, I can't do this. Nobody does this. The Beatles play on Beatles records, you know. This is John's job. This is George's job to play the guitar. But George didn't care. He didn't care about all this ego-ness about, oh, no one can play on Beatles records other than the Beatles. So he simply told Eric that, I want you to play on it. It's my song. So he managed to get Eric to come down to Abbey Road. So when George and Eric got down to Abbey Road, there was already, as soon as they arrived, a noticeable change in the atmosphere. John and Paul were already taking the song a lot more serious. George's idea of bringing in an outside musician to play on the track worked. It got them to take it more serious. So for the first portion of the session, George decided that he would lay down his lead vocals for the version of the song that the Beatles had recorded on August 16th. However, when he listened back to what had been recorded so far, he wasn't satisfied, so he decided that he would scrap absolutely everything that they had done so far and start afresh. So it was at this point that George decided to change it from an acoustic folk song into a heavier rock song, the version of While My Guitar Gently Weeps that we all know and love from the White Album. So the band got to work on recording the brand new basic track from scratch. Paul jumped onto the piano and almost straight away he came up with a brand new piano intro for the song. George was very happy with this, he was very pleased with the piano intro that Paul had come up with, so it went onto the track. The band recorded 28 takes of the basic track and they would decide that take 25 was the best of them all, so they would then start overdubbing take 25. Take 25 would feature Harrison's guide vocal and Harrison also playing the acoustic guitar, Lennon playing the organ, McCartney playing the piano, Ringo playing the drums and Eric Clapton playing the lead guitar. Eric played the lead guitar on every single one of those 28 takes and he played live in the studio with the band. So the following day on September 6th, 1968, George, Paul and Ringo would turn their attention to the overdubs required for the track. These overdubs would include Harrison's lead vocals, McCartney's harmony vocals as well as his bass and some tambourine from Ringo. And with all that, the song was finally completed to a standard that George felt the song deserved. The White Album was released on the 22nd of November 1968 and While My Guitar Gently Weeps was track number 7 on the running order. Eric Clapton was never formally given credit for playing lead guitar on the track. This was because at the time Eric was signed to a different record label to the Beatles, so if he wanted to take part formally and get paid and all of that, he would have to have been released by both his management and his label formally, so it would involve getting lawyers and contracts and all of that sort of stuff. And at the end of the day, he was only doing a favour for his mate, so he wasn't bothered, he wasn't bothered about formal credit, so yeah. To this day, it isn't actually formally credited with Eric Clapton on this song, but it's pretty common knowledge. It was common knowledge even at the time in the 60s that Eric Clapton played on it. So yeah, it's a shame really, because in this day and age it would probably be credited to the Beatles and Eric Clapton. So yeah, although Billy Preston would later get credit on Get Back, this was really the first time it happened where the Beatles would use an outside musician. So it should really be the Beatles and Eric Clapton this song's credited to, but yeah, it isn't. Business, eh? Good old music business. So for me, there is no denying that George Harrison's While My Guitar Gently Weeps is one of the most iconic songs on the White Album. It might be the most famous song on the entire White Album. It baffles me as well how John and Paul could not see George as a good songwriter by this point. George was as good as Lennon and McCartney by 1968. So how they couldn't see that when he was writing songs of this quality, I don't know. Now, in defence of Lennon and McCartney, because I know this has been quite critical of them in some ways, this video, the songs that they were writing at this point, they hadn't decreased in quality. John and Paul were still bloody great writers. They were still the best writers in the world, really. It's just George was now on an equal level to them. And, you know, when you're not writing bad songs, well, you know, you don't want to give up your space when you're still writing great songs. And if George had been given more space for more of his songs to go out there, which really he probably could have done on this album at least, we'd have lost Lennon and McCartney songs, and then it's a debate of, well, which ones would you want to lose? Okay, stuff like Wild Honey Pie, Revolution 9 and stuff, yeah, get rid of them. But then, like, other songs, well, which ones are we going to get rid of to get in place some of George's songs? I don't know. And it's a debate that will go on for many, many years. In the grand scheme of things, it doesn't matter because it ain't going to change. But yeah, in some ways, I mean, I do get why George was getting annoyed with John and Paul, but I also see it from John and Paul's side of things. They'd always been the songwriters. It was their scene, it was their thing. And, you know, they don't really want to give it up because they're still writing good songs. They are writing equally great songs. They haven't decreased in quality at all. I mean, look what Paul was writing. Blackbird, Back in the USSR. John's writing Dear Prudence, Julia, stuff like that. You know, it's not decreasing in quality for any of them. This is all four of them. Even Ringo entering a peak of their life. This is the start of the peak probably for all of them. Well, maybe not Paul and John, their peak maybe started around 65, 66 and would go on until the early 70s. But for George, this is definitely where his peak started. Now, I recently watched a YouTube video from Mean Mr. Mayo, and as a side note, he's actually one of the inspirations for this channel. He was what inspired me to start it many years ago now, like, oh, how long has it been? 7, 8 years ago now? It was 2016, 2017 when I started doing all this. So yeah, he was one of the inspirations. But anyway, when I watched his video recently, he was saying that to him, he feels that George Harrison was the best lyricist in the entire Beatles. And you know what? I've got to say, I agree. I think George is the best lyricist out of them all. whilst I would say as an overall writer, Paul is probably the best out of them all. He's probably the greatest songwriter of all time, Paul McCartney. When it comes to lyrics alone, George was in a different league. You know, Paul can still write great lyrics, John can write great lyrics, but George, I mean, listen to the lyrics on this song and some of his other tracks on the White Album, and just George's lyrics in general, they're brilliant. I think where George maybe struggled more was the melody. He wasn't perhaps quite as good as what McCartney was, in particular with a melody, but when it came to lyrics, I mean, yeah, just listen to the lyrics on this song, just read them. You don't even need the music, just read the lyrics, they are brilliant. I mean, how can you have someone writing lyrics that good in your band and not think that they are your equal? It's baffling. I mean, it's quite incredible in some ways that these musicians live so close to each other, that they grew up so close to each other, that they even met. John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, three of the greatest songwriters of all time, and they are in the same band. The three greatest songwriters, arguably, on the planet at the time in 1968, and they're all in the same band. It's incredible. They all grew up in the same city. They all met each other. Isn't it amazing? The Beatles, man, what a band. So that concludes this episode of the White Album in depth. Thank you very much for watching. I'm aware this has been quite a long video, but you know, it's an iconic song, so there is a lot to say about it. And you know, it's our first time talking about a George song, so there's always going to be a lot to say there. Anyway, like I say, thank you very much for watching. If you have enjoyed this, please do consider subscribing. There is also a playlist on my channel that consists of all previous episodes of this series, and all future episodes of this series will also go in there. Anyway, I will see you next time, where we will be looking at the song that both Paul McCartney and George Harrison has described as their favourite songs on the White Album. Until then though, do take care. I'm not going to start playing it for you.